welcome back to the EOC Podcast, Emergency Operations Conversations. I am your host, Jeff Perkins, and I'm very happy that you're tuning back into episode number 2 of our special investigative series, Federal Firestorm, the FEMA Files. In episode 1, we trace the history of FEMA, how it came to be, the key disasters that shaped it, and the legislative framework that underpins its role in American emergency management. Today we move from history to headlines. We're diving into what may be one of the most consequential evolutions of FEMA's grant-making system in decades. Episode 2 is titled Grants, Gaps, and the Great Freeze, How States Are Navigating FEMA's Changing Grant Landscape. From the sweeping restructuring of grant processes to the controversial cancellation of major funding programs like BRIC, and to the very real delays in disaster aid experienced by states like Oregon and others, this episode brings together facts, testimonies, and analysis to help emergency managers and the public understand what's changing and why it matters. So let's dig into it, shall we? So FEMA's grant architecture has long been considered one of the essential pillars of national emergency preparedness. The system was designed not only to provide money, but to build enduring capacity for disaster mitigation, response, recovery, and continuity across all levels of government. The philosophy behind the grant system is that disasters are local until they become national, and robust, flexible, and timely grant programs are the connective tissue between Washington, D.C. and the county level or even city level emergency operations centers. The Emergency Management Performance Grant, or EMPG, is a lifeline for state and local emergency management agencies, offering a 50-50 cost share that funds positions, exercises, planning, public outreach, and essential equipment. Without EMPG, many jurisdictions, especially in rural America, would not be able to maintain full-time emergency management positions. These funds are critical not just for response, but also for hazard mitigation and continuity of operations planning. The Homeland Security Grant Program, or HSGP, which includes the State Homeland Security Program, or SHSP, the Urban Area Security Initiative, also known as UASI, and the Operation Stone Garden, or OPSG, which focuses on terrorism, prevention, border security, cybersecurity, and interoperable communications. It has funded fusion centers, public safety answering point upgrades, which are 911 centers, and physical security improvements in cities considered high-risk targets. BRIC, or Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, represented a strategic shift towards pre-disaster investment. As disasters become more frequent and costly, federal policymakers recognized that mitigation needed to be proactive. So under the Biden administration, BRIC was significantly expanded. Now, it emphasized equitable access under Biden, innovation, and climate adaptation. BRIC projects often took a whole community approach, engaging utilities, nonprofits, tribal government, and academic institutions to build long-term resilience. Now, under the new Trump administration, FEMA has declared BRIC to be wasteful and overly politicized. The program has been terminated, not only going forward, but also retroactively. FEMA has canceled applications from 2020 through 2023 and begun the process of reclaiming unspent funds from awarded grants. For emergency managers, the cancellation signals a dramatic shift in what types of projects and partnerships will be supported under FEMA's new vision. This isn't just about redirecting funds. It's about a fundamental redefinition of what preparedness looks like in America. The tension between traditional disaster response and forward-looking mitigation strategies is playing out at the policy level in real time, and jurisdictions across the country are scrambling to adjust. Since January 2025, FEMA has paused or slowed the disbursement of billions of dollars in grants and disaster reimbursements as part of a wider spending review ordered by the new Trump administration. Though the administration insists this is a temporary measure to verify the integrity of the programs, the real-world effects have so far been very profound. In Oregon, $129 million in federal reimbursements for declared disaster remains inaccessible, jeopardizing not just infrastructure recovery projects, but also staff salaries. The director of Oregon Emergency Management has voiced concerns publicly and in court documents, stating that the lack of funding could leave local emergency managers unpaid within weeks. Similar scenarios are unfolding in Hawaii, Colorado, Arizona, and Illinois, where delays are threatening wildfire recovery, urban flood mitigation, and emergency operations center upgrades. FEMA urges that payments are simply under review, not frozen, and that the agency is working through a backlog with due diligence. However, state officials have provided documentation showing extended timelines, inconsistent communication, and significant disruptions. Local jurisdictions have expressed confusion over new requirements, requests for resubmission of documentation, and abrupt status changes to approved applications. Adding complexity is a March 6 federal court order mandating that the administration release the frozen funds. While FEMA claims compliance, states have filed additional court motions asserting that delays continue and that FEMA's interpretation of the injunction is overly narrow. Legal scholars have noted that while there is no finding of contempt yet, the friction between judicial orders and administrative action is escalating. These reviews aren't limited to BRIC. EMPG and HSGP awards are also experiencing significant delays. In one western state, multiple fusion centers have delayed equipment procurement, training exercises have been postponed, and cybersecurity projects meant to defend critical infrastructure remain unfunded. For communities still recovering from recent hurricanes, wildfires, and floods, this pause is more than a bureaucratic adjustment. It's a disruption with direct operational consequences, postponed deployments, delayed sheltering operations, and uncertainty around future planning. Before the current administration's dramatic shift in FEMA grant policy, the Biden administration pursued a sweeping reimagining of disaster preparedness and recovery. That framework, while grounded in themes of modernization, equity, and climate adaptation, was not universally praised, and its benefits were accompanied by notable challenges in implementation, scope, and execution. However, in stark contrast to the Trump administration's current review and rollback of these programs, the Biden-era strategy embraced an expansive federal role and promoted FEMA as a partner in building long-term national resilience. At the heart of the Biden administration's vision was the belief that proactive investment, especially in underserved and climate-vulnerable communities, could significantly reduce costs and casualties of future disasters. FEMA's grant infrastructure was recalibrated around that philosophy. Major initiatives launched during this time included the Climate Adaptation Action Plan, and this initiative aligned FEMA's grant criteria with the broader federal government's climate change agenda. It encouraged projects that accounted for sea level rise, wildfire risk, extreme weather, and infrastructure hardening. There was also the Community Disaster Resilience Zones, or CDRZ, and FEMA identified high-risk communities, often rural, low-income, or historically underserved, and gave them preferred access to BRIC funding, technical assistance, and long-term hazard mitigation support. Expanded access for tribal and rural communities was also one of the pillars of the changes, and the agency simplified application processes for small jurisdictions, particularly tribal nations and remote counties, by allowing bundled submissions, offering application walkthroughs, and deploying FEMA regional staff to provide on-the-ground support. FEMA also revised the Emergency Management Performance Grant guidance to allow funds to be used for pandemic preparedness, mental health resilience, community engagement, and public information campaigns. This flexibility was well received by local agencies with evolving community-facing roles. While ambitious, these reforms were not without complications. The rapid expansion of the allowable costs created confusion for some grantees unaccustomed to navigating the nuances of cost eligibility. Additionally, the effort to prioritize historically underserved communities, while morally sound, drew lots of criticism for lacking sufficient administrative support to ensure equitable execution. Several jurisdictions reported difficulty translating FEMA's new guidance into practical application strategies, particularly those with limited staffing or grant writing capability. Further, critics argued that FEMA's increased focus on climate resilience inadvertently deprioritized certain traditional threats. For example, Homeland Security stakeholders in major metro areas expressed concern that terrorism prevention and physical security measures had received less attention, both in rhetoric and in funding weight. Meanwhile, some state emergency managers lamented the increased complexity of reporting requirements, which they felt were burdensome in light of modest financial gains. Still, the overarching shift was notable. Under Biden, FEMA was not merely reactive, it was positioned as a strategic partner in community transformation. National stakeholder summits, resilient roundtables, and working groups on equity in emergency management became common. Fast forward to this Trump administration, and nearly all of these initiatives have either been suspended, rescinded, or placed under review. The stated rationale is cost-cutting, risk management, and the elimination of what the administration calls wasteful and politicized spending. The decision to terminate the BRIC program is a cornerstone of this new approach. While BRIC begun under the first Trump administration, its expansion under Biden, especially in targeting climate change and equity, has now been sharply criticized and completely defunded. In contrast to the Biden-era strategy of federal leadership and expansive support, the current administration favors decentralization. Rather than a FEMA that proactively guides mitigation and resilience, President Trump has floated the idea of just eliminating the agency altogether, replacing it with a model where states receive disaster response funding directly through block grants. This model, rooted in a states-first interpretation of federalism, emphasizes local control, administrative minimalism, and fiscal restraint. Where Biden's FEMA sought to identify and empower the most vulnerable communities, the Trump administration has raised concerns that such targeting opens the door to politicized grant-making. While Biden-era grants often prioritized environmental justice and climate-forward infrastructure, Trump officials argue that this introduced bias and mission creep into FEMA's core mandate. Instead, the administration has begun reassessing grant programs based on adherence to traditional preparedness metrics, risk to life, population impact, and cost effectiveness. The administration has also restructured its review process. While the Biden administration emphasized application accessibility, especially for small jurisdictions, the Trump administration is reinstating more rigorous compliance and documentation standards. Grant applications are now subject to manual reviews, and there is increased emphasis on traditional cost-benefit analysis over social impact narratives. These changes, while aiming for greater accountability, have slowed the pace of disbursements. Unlike the Biden approach that prioritized rapid investment and planning support, the Trump framework is more skeptical of pre-disaster spending, especially for non-structural projects like education campaigns or climate assessments. What remains to be seen is whether the current administration will replace the rescinded programs with new frameworks or operate under a new, leaner version of FEMA as a short-term logistical agency. For now, states that had aligned their planning strategies with the Biden-era model, developing multi-year mitigation projects, pursuing resilience bonds, and hiring staff for equity-focused initiatives, are now left in limbo. The Biden administration built a forward-looking, climate-aware, and equity-centered vision for FEMA grant-making. It aimed to shift the narrative from disaster recovery to disaster prevention. Its efforts had both strengths, such as broader inclusion and climate resilience, and flaws, including complexity and implementation hurdles. In stark contrast, the current administration is dismantling much of that vision in favor of traditional emergency management paradigms, focused on cost control, decentralized responsibility, and a narrower federal scope. The tension between these models, progressive planning versus pragmatic minimalism, is now playing out in courtrooms, grant offices, and emergency operations centers across the United States. One of the most consequential developments in recent months has been the Trump administration's formation of a Federal Review Council tasked with evaluating the future existence of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. Established through an executive order issued in February 2025, the council comprises senior officials from the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, and a select group of state governors. Their primary mandate is to explore whether FEMA should continue to exist in its current form, or if it should be dismantled and its responsibilities devolved to the states. Among the options being studied is the transition to a block grant model, and this is where states will receive direct funding to manage their own disaster response efforts independent of any federal coordination. This review has caused ripples, and in some corners, waves, across the emergency management and public safety sectors. For decades, FEMA has operated not only as a funder, but as the central nervous system of the nation's disaster response infrastructure. Its role extends well beyond issuing checks. FEMA manages the logistics supply chain during emergencies, deploys surge personnel during presidential disaster declarations. It supports interagency coordination through the National Response Framework and provides rapid technical assistance through specialized teams like Urban Search and Rescue and the Mobile Emergency Response Support, or MERS. Removing or replacing FEMA risks creating a gaping void in the country's ability to mount unified responses to large-scale catastrophes like hurricanes, wildfires, and terrorist attacks. The frequency and intensity of wildfires, floods, and hurricanes continues to grow. Cybersecurity incidents, infrastructure failures, and public health emergencies now require multidisciplinary, whole-of-government responses. FEMA has historically served as the backbone of these efforts. Any restructuring of the agency must carefully consider whether states are prepared to shoulder these responsibilities and whether local jurisdictions can absorb the administrative burdens currently managed by federal grant programs. Ultimately, the Review Council's findings will have lasting impacts. Will FEMA remain a centralized federal agency with national coordinating authority, or will its functions be distributed to states under a radically altered framework? No one really knows. But in the meantime, FEMA's internal shakeups, staffing challenges, and policy shifts are already reshaping the operational landscape for emergency managers across the country. The ground level impacts of these recent policy changes are becoming more and more visible with each passing week. Across the United States, emergency management agencies are encountering delays, administrative uncertainty, and operational disruptions, not only for future projects under planning, but also for initiatives that are already underway and in the advanced stages of execution. In Arizona, a multi-agency wildfire mitigation project involving 17 rural fire protection districts and a coalition of academic institutions has been formally dismantled. The program, originally awarded through FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC program, in 2023, was designed to conduct fuel load assessments, implement fire breaks, and evaluate the effectiveness of remote sensing tools for wildfire protection. Initial work had begun, including community outreach, contractor engagement, and interagency coordination. However, in early 2025, subrecipients received a formal communication stating that disbursements had been halted and that pragmatic changes were under review. Without clarity on the timeline for reinstatement or whether any funds would be reimbursed, the districts began winding down operations. Contractors were released, pre-scheduled controlled burns were canceled, and state fire officials reported that the local partners had incurred planning and personnel costs with no clear pathway to recovery. In North Carolina, 2 counties were in the process of modernizing their emergency operations centers, or EOCs, with upgraded radio systems and data infrastructure supported by Emergency Management Performance Grants, or EMPG, as well as Urban Area Security Initiative's UASI funds. Equipment procurement was timed to coincide with the expiration of legacy systems. However, in the first quarter of 2025, grant reimbursements were paused pending a compliance review, and local officials were advised not to proceed with any further expenditures. Procurement cycles subsequently expired, vendor quotes became invalid due to inflation, and one manufacturer discontinued the model originally specified for the project. The counties now face the prospect of reinitiating their entire procurement process, which may take several months and require a complete redesign of system specifications. Another growing concern is the impact on personnel. Recruiting and retaining skilled emergency management professionals is increasingly difficult in an environment of grant uncertainty. Historically, many jurisdictions have relied on EMPG and Homeland Security Grant Program HSGP funding to support core staffing positions like planners, training coordinators, GIS analysts, and public information officers. With that funding now subject to delays or reevaluation, local agencies are left unable to offer reliable employment terms. Several states have reported resignations, hiring freezes, and the inability to fill critical roles. The operational impact is compounded by the timing of these disruptions. Many jurisdictions planned their 2024 and 2025 program calendars around previously approved grant cycles. When those cycles were frozen or modified without warning, training sessions, community education events, exercises, and procurement projects had to be canceled or indefinitely postponed. The evolving situation surrounding FEMA's grants administration and broader role in emergency management raises several foundational questions that policymakers, practitioners, and the public must grapple with. As federal grant programs stall or shift direction under administrative review, and critical funding pathways become unpredictable, the need to clarify the agency's mission and future structure becomes increasingly urgent. First and foremost, there is growing debate around the role FEMA should play in disaster preparedness and resilience funding. Traditionally, FEMA has acted as both a grant administrator and an operational response entity. It allocates billions of dollars annually through programs like BRIC, HSGP, and EMPG, while also serving as the lead federal responder during emergencies. But critics argue that the dual role has created tension within the agency, balancing bureaucratic grant processing with on-the-ground surge capacity. With increasing expectations and mounting disaster frequency, some question whether FEMA can effectively manage both domains without one suffering. Another question centers around the balance between local flexibility and national priorities. During the Biden administration, FEMA emphasized equity and climate resilience, pushing for targeted investments in historically underserved areas and long-term mitigation projects. However, the shift under the current administration prioritizes a more traditional risk-based model, which some argue better ensures fiscal responsibility. This contrast highlights a broader philosophical divide. Should FEMA act as primarily a neutral funder of disaster relief, or should it drive national strategic priorities through funding incentives and policy levers? Striking the right balance is complicated and requires a consensus that, at present, does not exist. Moreover, concerns about politicization of disaster funding are growing louder. Reports of different grant processing based on state policies, such as sanctuary designations, have prompted accusations of bias. While the federal government has denied these claims and cited fraud prevention as the rationale for additional scrutiny, the perception of politically influenced funding decisions is damaging to trust in the system. Yet there remains a need to safeguard against misuse of public funds. The challenge lies in developing oversight mechanisms that ensure transparency and compliance without allowing partisan influence to skew the decision-making. FEMA's ability to serve as a central node in the National Preparedness and Response Framework depends on its ability to provide reliable funding streams and consistent technical support. Without clarity, consistency, and transparency in grant administration, the foundation of this system begins to erode. The current landscape presents a paradox. On one hand, the call for accountability, efficiency, and decentralization reflects legitimate concerns about government overreach and spending. On the other are the loss of coordinated national strategy, risks creating a fragmented disaster response environment where outcomes vary wildly depending on state resources, priorities, and political alignment. This period of reevaluation presents an opportunity to ask fundamental questions about how FEMA operates and what role it should play in emergency management going forward. The road ahead requires honest dialogue, bipartisan cooperation, and shared commitment to protecting the nation's preparedness infrastructure. So we've covered a lot today. Major program cancellations, funding freezes, legal disputes, strategic reorientation, and local consequences. And all of it comes down to a single theme: uncertainty. FEMA's grants are supposed to build certainty. They're meant to ensure that when the call comes, when the sirens wail, when the communities break out their emergency operations plans, the tools, training, and personnel are ready. But if the grants themselves become unpredictable, then readiness suffers, and it raises a question we haven't yet answered. How did we get here? The FEMA grant system for decades has served as a safety net and scaffolding, supporting local and state emergency management offices with funding, training, and coordination. Over time, that system evolved. Under different administrations, it expanded and contracted. It became more technical, more targeted, and occasionally more politicized. But at its core, it always represented a federal commitment to help communities prepare, respond, and recover. Now, with that commitment being reviewed, restructured, or perhaps rescinded, we have to ask what comes next. If the federal government decides to step back from its central role in disaster preparedness and recovery, what does expanded local control actually look like in practice? Because local control in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. In many ways, it's a principle that emergency managers value. Decisions made closer to the community, guided by local knowledge and informed by direct experience. And after all emergencies begin and end at the local level. But local control without structure, without funding, and without support can lead to fragmented outcomes. Some states and counties have robust emergency management programs, well-staffed, well-trained, and financially supported by their state. Others, especially rural or underserved jurisdictions, may lack those resources and may not be able to absorb the responsibilities without assistance. So the question becomes, is there a transition plan? If FEMA does scale back or is eliminated entirely, will the states receive those block grants? Will they be given new authorities or tools to stand up their own programs if they don't have any in place? Who will maintain national level situational awareness? Who will coordinate mutual aid across state lines? Who sets baseline standards for training, credentialing, or incident command? These are not hypothetical concerns, they're operational realities. And without a roadmap for what decentralized emergency management would look like, the risk is that some communities will surge ahead while others fall behind, creating disparities in disaster response, resilience, and recovery. At a time when disasters are becoming more frequent and more complex, from wildfires to floods, cyber attacks, and pandemics, the infrastructure of emergency management should be getting stronger, not more fragile. As we continue this series, we'll take a closer look at FEMA's internal workforce. We'll also explore what state and local agencies are doing to adapt to this new, changing environment. And we'll ask the most important question of all: how do we go forward with a system that works, regardless of who's in office? I thank you again for joining me on today's episode of the EOC podcast, Emergency Operations Conversations. I look forward to continuing the FEMA Files series, and I hope you like it. I also ask that you get the word out. Let's share this podcast. Share as much as you can if you feel obligated to do so. I appreciate you being here, and I will see you on the next episode.